New York recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I went over to the department yesterday for a couple of hours to review some of the unredacted materials. And I am looking forward to your detailed explanation for why you have withheld almost half of the documents, which is required by the bill. Now, obviously, there are 3 million documents, so I didn't get through much. But one thing I didn't see was the client list that you said you had on your desk a year ago. I did, however, find a couple of important documents. An 86-page prosecution memo from the Southern District of New York and a draft indictment from Florida against Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators. For reasons that I cannot understand nor are permitted by the bill, they were still redacted, even for members of Congress. So, Ms. Bondi, will you commit right here to immediately providing those two documents in unredacted form to members of Congress? Not a complicated question.
Well, I guess it is for you because you have a law degree and those are privileged.
Okay, they're not privileged, but we will discuss that later. I also found an email that I have right here from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell that was unredacted, and it included notes of statements that Donald Trump made about his prior relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, there is no reason for this to be hidden from the American people. There is no privilege, there is no attorney-client privilege, and I see you're checking with your staff, and I can assure you, staff, this is not under attorney-client privilege because it was sent from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell. Will you commit to publicly providing the unredacted version of this so that the American people can understand the extent of Donald Trump's lies about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?
What you just watched is not a routine congressional hearing. That is a former federal prosecutor holding a piece of paper that he says contains Donald Trump's own words about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and the nation's top law enforcement officer refusing to let the American people see it. Dan Goldman is a congressman from New York who spent years as an assistant U.S. attorney before entering politics. He walked into that hearing room having already visited the Department of Justice to review Epstein files firsthand. What he found, he says, was a pattern, not a clerical error. Pam Bondi, at the time of this exchange, was the sitting Attorney General of the United States. She had spent nearly a year promising transparency on Epstein. She had gone on television, held up the prospect of a client list sitting on her desk, and positioned herself as the person who would finally deliver accountability. What Goldman found instead was an 86-page prosecution memo, a draft indictment against Epstein co-conspirators, and an email between Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, all still redacted even from members of Congress. And just 2 months after this hearing, Bondi was fired. She is now fighting a congressional subpoena for her sworn testimony. The cover-up, it turns out, has its own paper trail. Goldman just laid out two separate but connected schemes.
You're about as good of a lawyer today as you were when you tried to impeach President Trump in 2016. Have you apologized for that in 2019?
So will you unredact this? Will you
were
unredact
lead
this?
counsel on that. Privileged.
I'm asking you, will you unredact this?
Privileged.
Privileged, of course. I look forward to discussing this more. Now, these are obviously improper redactions.
And let me stop for a minute.
I'm talking.
If they're not privileged,
quiet.
Don't yell at me. If they're not
Mr. Chairman, would you stop the clock? This is on your time. It's not on Mr. Goldman.
Even
though you used your improper redactions,
you'll like my answer.
To continue to protect
Donald
Time belongs to the member.
We'll be happy to release them.
We'll stop the clock. We'll stop the clock. Time belongs to the member. Go ahead.
Even though you used improper redactions to protect Donald Trump and other predators associated with Jeffrey Epstein, you did the exact opposite thing with the survivors and victims of this scheme. So their identification information was really the only thing required to be redacted, and it was not. And it's clear this was not a mistake. This was not by accident. This was not because you only had 30 days when you really used 75, and that doesn't even include all the hours last March that you were redacting it. But I'll tell you why it's clear it wasn't a mistake. There is an email entitled Epstein Victim List. There are 32 names. 1 is redacted, 31 are not. So someone looked at it and decided to redact something. And I will tell you that that is clearly intentional to intimidate these survivors and victims.
Scandals in one hearing. First, a DOJ that used improper legal privilege claims to hide documents implicating powerful men. Second, a DOJ that somehow got the redactions exactly backwards, shielding predators while exposing the women they abused. He described a document called Epstein Victim List, 32 names, 1 redacted, 31 left exposed. Someone at the Department of Justice reviewed that list and made a choice. That is not a system failure. That is a decision. Here is the irony that should not be lost. Bondi spent months publicly insisting her DOJ was protecting victims. She used that language to justify delays, partial releases, and missing documents. But the one category of names that the law absolutely required to be protected, the survivors, were the names left in plain sight. The names that actually needed covering were the ones that got it. Goldman called this intentional intimidation of witnesses and victims. After Bondi was fired, NPR reported that DOJ actively removed Epstein files referencing Trump.
Said that any victim that wants to speak with the department has done so, hopefully. Well, thanks to the incredibly brave people sitting here behind you, we can actually ask them if that's true. Now, would the survivors and victims who are here please stand up one more time? Just by show of hands, how many of you or your loved ones actually have met with the Department of Justice and provided testimony and estimate and evidence? None. And of those of you who have not met, which is everyone, how many of you have reached out either individually or through a lawyer or representative to offer to provide testimony and evidence? All of them. And of those of you, all of you, who have reached out, how many of you were denied or ignored by the Department of Justice? All of them. And despite the shameful and despicable efforts by Ms. Bondi and her department to intimidate you, how many of you are still willing to speak to the Department of Justice? All of them. Well, Ms. Bondi, it looks like you have some more witnesses
Gentlemen, this
to
time
talk
has expired.
to, and I yield back.
We will go to the good gentleman.
Trump from its public database. That is not redaction. That is deletion. What just happened is not theater. It is sworn contradiction rendered in real time. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche had gone on record saying that any victim who wanted to speak with the department had done so. Goldman did not argue with that claim. He just asked the survivors in the room to answer it themselves. Every single one had reached out. Every single one had been denied or ignored. Every single one was still willing to testify. That is not a coincidence. That is the shape of a deliberate policy. Now consider the timeline. Bondi took office in February 2025. By July 2025, an internal DOJ memo showed the department had quietly closed all active investigations into Epstein co-conspirators. By December 2025, the DOJ had missed the legal deadline set by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a bipartisan law, to release unredacted documents. By February 2026, at this hearing, Bondi told Congress under oath that there was no evidence Donald Trump had committed a crime. 2 weeks later, Goldman and Ted Lieu formally accused her of perjury, citing DOJ's own released documents as the contradiction.
New York recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I went over to the department yesterday for a couple of hours to review some of the unredacted materials. And I am looking forward to your detailed explanation for why you have withheld almost half of the documents, which is required by the bill. Now, obviously, there are 3 million documents, so I didn't get through much. But one thing I didn't see was the client list that you said you had on your desk a year ago. I did, however, find a couple of important documents. An 86-page prosecution memo from the Southern District of New York, and a draft indictment from Florida against Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators. For reasons that I cannot understand nor are permitted by the bill, they were still redacted, even for members of Congress. So, Ms. Bondi, will you commit right here to immediately providing those two documents in unredacted form to members of Congress?
Then Trump fired her. Then her DOJ argued her subpoena was void because she no longer held the title. The survivors are still waiting for their meeting. Here is what this hearing actually proved. Pam Bondi had every opportunity to be the Attorney General who delivered the truth about Jeffrey Epstein. She had the files. She had the legal mandate. She had a bipartisan law requiring disclosure. She had survivors sitting in the room behind her, willing to testify, waiting for a meeting that never came. Instead, she invoked privilege on an email between two private citizens. She left 31 survivors' names exposed while shielding the powerful. She told Congress under oath there was no evidence of Trump's wrongdoing, while her own department's documents contradicted her. She is now accused of perjury by two former federal prosecutors who were sitting in that room. And then she was fired. Not because she covered too little, because she covered too much, and it became impossible to defend. Goldman walked into that hearing with documents the department never expected a member of Congress to find. He found an 86-page prosecution memo, a draft indictment, an email. He found the shape of what was being buried and made it visible on live television. The survivors in that room raised every single hand when asked if they had been denied by the DOJ. They raised every single hand when asked if they were still willing to testify. That is not a congressional hearing. That is a verdict rendered by the people this system was supposed to protect. Bondi is now evading a subpoena. The files are still missing. Trump's name appears in those documents over 38,000 times. The American people have seen approximately 2% of the total material. If this story concerns you, the most important thing you can do is stay informed, share what you've learned, and demand that your representatives keep this on the public record. Subscribe, leave a comment, and do not let this disappear from the conversation.